My question, I guess, not specifically to you, but to the panel. I'm Moroccan, but I have a nephew who is half Jewish. His mother is Jewish American, and his dad is Moroccan Muslim. He went on a birthright trip as well. He also felt like it was Disneyland, and he's very torn with that question. What you're going through. He's a little bit younger than you still, so he's still at the point where he's wondering what the truth is, because I tell him I've studied Middle studies and I know a little bit about that. What breaks my heart is the knowledge that Jews and Muslims have lived for millennia in peace, and the narrative that the Zionists have painted since the creation of Israel and before is that we're enemies. And in fact, most of the horrors committed against the Jewish people were committed by the Christians. From the pogroms of Russia and Ukraine to the Holocaust and Inquisition. Right now there are a lot of Moroccan Jews that keep coming back to Morocco because they can claim their passports and they can visit the sites and they tell their stories now, how they were treated when they went to Israel because of the propaganda, not because of the persecution really. Of course there was some anger at during war times, but there was never a persecution. In fact, Moroccan Jews are very proud of their roots, very proud of Mohammed V, that was a king during the Vichy regime in France that also occupied Morocco, because he refused to send them to German camps. What can we do today to change that narrative? And I know that, with technology and social media, we can share a lot more readily and tell our stories. I can't imagine a world without Israel, to be honest with you. My question is, because it's practically impossible to imagine a Palestinian state in the territory that's left, is it possible to imagine a confederate state that would be not necessarily Jewish, a Palestinian-Israel confederacy where both people can live together? Is that something, a one-state solution, basically?
I think, and I assume that my contributors would agree, that's the only solution left, really. We believe in equality here, and we certainly have a long ways to go here, but both here and elsewhere, there are many examples of societies that are very diverse and where diverse peoples have learned to live together. I think that the two-state solution was very flawed. It looked like an easy solution at the time, many of us embraced it because it seemed as though it would be a solution, and it would work, and it would work faster than any other. But in fact, well, first of all, as the Israelis are making clearer by the day, they never really wanted it, and they sabotaged it as hard as they could the whole time. But I think one of the lessons of Zionism is that a state built on one ethnic group that privileges one ethnic group over another is bound to fail, and so I don't think it would have worked. I think the only solution really is equality, complete equality between peoples, and maybe something like a truth and reconciliation process as they had in South Africa. It's interesting that you mention Moroccans, because I have two Moroccan Jewish contributors. One of them is a wonderful poet, and he told me that he was too busy and he couldn't write me a narrative, but would I accept this poem, which he thought told his story better than he could if he wrote a narrative. It's a wonderful poem. It's addressed to Mahmoud Darwish, and really sort of contrasts what it's like to be an exile, and to know that you're firmly rooted in a place, and then to be a settler and to not have roots in a place that you can identify with, and to be sort of betwixt and between. It's a wonderful poem. The other is by a lawyer named Clarice Harbon, who talks about the extreme discrimination that she was subjected to as a Moroccan Jew in Israel, and who was inspired by all of this to become a lawyer who identifies with the poor and the dispossessed and fights for their rights. I also we've seen this wonderful film about Moroccan Jews, which you probably know which one I'm talking about. They Promised Us the Sea. So that I recommend to anybody who hasn't already seen it. It really, the music is beautiful, and it very powerfully,
The visuals.
yes, describes the situation and the culture.
Could I just add something to that? I think so. At first, I think you're right that the only solution there was only ever the one-state solution. There might have been the two-state result, but the solution to the problem had to be a single state, because that's the only way to undo this sort of ethnic nationalism. And I think it's something we don't talk about on the other side too. Nationalism, in any form, is dangerous.
Yeah, as we see so much in the States right now.
And I think that a nationalism it's not only a problem of sort of the white supremacy inherent in sort of an Ashkenazi defined Jewish state, but a Palestinian state, right, when you have a diversity within Palestinians as well, is a dangerous thing as well. When you have such a state so tied to a particular narrative, I think a single multicultural state is the only possibility. But I think I just had a thought on what you mentioned in the beginning, right? The relationship between Zionism and this narrative of Jews and Muslims as enemies somehow. I think it really exposes the fact that Zionism is such a useful tool of Islamophobia and more generally anti-Arab racism, of course, because there are Christians in Palestine and across the Arab world as well. And I think that we have to expose that for what it is. Right. It's a tool. Right. It's a rhetoric, because as a result of the history of Jews in America, right, that has led to sort of this sort of weird position that Jews occupy, especially Ashkenazi Jews, right, as sort of privileged by white supremacy, but still in this weird anti-Semitism obviously still exists. We have to expose that the use of Zionism to sort of keep Jews aligned with Christians against Muslims and people of Arab descent more generally, and that of course is tied into various other forms of racism as well. We have to expose that, and I think that is useful as well in constructing sort of a view of Zionism and a conversation about Zionism, not only as a tool of white supremacy, but as inextricably linked with white supremacy.
Christian evangelicals today are almost more Zionist.
Numerically, there are simply, it's a fact that there are
they're
more.
Pushing a narrative that is, crazy thinking, really, with their, and they're influencing American policy to
Christian Zionism predated Jewish Zionism by about 2 centuries.
And I think what you're talking about too is it's tied to anti-Semitism as well, because this Christian Zionist narrative is very much built on a very problematic and arguably anti-Semitic view of Judaism as well. Very minimizing, a minimalistic sort of putting Jews in a particular box in the sort of narrative of Judeo-Christianity as sort of as it relates to Christianity and the fight against Islam. It's a very dangerous rhetoric that they use.
Let me ask you a question. Three of you were influenced in your teens or early 20s. How do you bring to children in their early school years the recognition of colonialism, racism, nationalism, all these isms we're talking about? How does one get? Because the influence of America on this situation is huge, hugely negative. How do you approach young people, younger than when you started questioning these things and getting involved? How do you get this information to the younger people?
I think children are actually easier than adults, to be honest.
Really?
Yeah.
I think also in the world that we live in, all of these things that you talked about can be seen in a very local place. So connecting them to how that affects their own lives and their own city that they live in is a really good place to start, because it's much more understandable than thinking on these global levels. But, you know, if there's students in DC, all of these things you can see happening and affecting
So
their
you feel
lives
this
here.
is happening now? Do you feel this is really happening now
Sure.
at the younger in America?
To an extent, and I think also it's important. I think the work being done in us, like breaking down the kind of monolithic idea that you are identifying as a Jewish person, and you, like, where I grew up, like, where you have the 20 by 10 foot Israeli flag in front of temple you go to every week, and there's no conversation about it. By having adults starting these conversations and then breaking up that monolithic presentation to young people where they only are presented with one option, I think is really important and impactful as well.
Yes, you had a
I
hand
just
up.
wanted to add that, excuse me, Abraham Berg, in the book Days to Come,
Yeah.
he specifies literally step by step the concept of a one state Palestine, one state Israel solution, just like Miko Pellet, the son of the General Rati Pellet,
Yes.
which is quite particularly in this upcoming newer generation feasible. That would be not this, there would be no disruption, no dislocation. One land with two peoples that collaborate, co-produce, co-heal, co-create. It's all very doable. But that president is a German Jew. My parents were also German Jews. Maybe Gantz, who also has a Jewish background, will now make an alliance with the Arab party of Israeli residents.
I don't have very much hope for Gantz. I was just talking today with a Palestinian activist who I think many of us have met on trips to Hebron, Issa Amro, and he was saying how smart he thinks that the position taken by his name is. I asked him about this man, and then his name is just evaporated from my head all of a sudden. The politician who was the head of the joint list. Ayman Odeh. Yes, that he thinks it's a very smart policy to say, look, we're willing to collaborate, we're willing to partner with you, because this forces the Israelis to expose very clearly, that they won't, and that this is not a democracy, and that the problem is not on the Palestinian side. Yes, there are of course people in Israel who have articulated plans. There's also Abu Sita, who Palestinian, who talked about how, in fact, much of the land in Israel is occupied by the military and is not serving any particular productive purpose, is not lived on, and that land could easily be used for the return of Palestinian refugees. So there are ideas, and there in fact are groups of people who are meeting and trying to hammer out possible models for the future. But of course, they're very, very they're a very, very small minority, and hopefully their time will come.
I think that the idea is taking root since the time President Karcher wrote his book. And he was demonized since. I mean, his reputation was destroyed almost, you know, in so many circles after he wrote that book.
Issa said that he was invited, strangely enough, by J Street, and he said that in an address at the J Street conference, he said that Israel was an apartheid state, and he was applauded by the audience. So,
J Street.
Really?
At J Street, yes. So he was arguing that the rank and file of J Street are moving, even though the leadership may be very reluctant.
So yeah, maybe two things. One about the one state. So it's interesting because it's basically operating as one state now, but just for
Right,
Jewish people.
an apartheid state.
Yeah. So that's why I feel like this conversation, maybe also you're saying that J Street is moving towards like accepting Israel as an apartheid, or so that's, I don't know if I would see this as hope or more as, you know, there, like also Ayman Oda and what he says when people talk about how to basically address the internal Israeli politics of like, yeah, we're accepting this state, but let's make it better. Let's make this system of the Israeli state not an apartheid state and not, not like a right wing, which Netanyahu makes it very clear to oppose Israel.
Right.
That's why it's very easy to oppose Israel now when Netanyahu is in leadership, but it's very hard when Gantz will become let's say the prime minister, because then it would be, it's a better state. And then the question of privilege kind of disappeared from the discussion, which is kind of very scary, because here my question to you maybe about this journey among Israelis, Jewish people, and not just maybe American Jewish people or Mizrahi Jewish people who were also victims, but let's say Ashkenazi Jewish Israelis who live there, and you know they're basically benefiting from all the privilege, but then it's very hard for them also to see this path. Or sometimes it's easy to see it because of the privilege, sometimes, but it's easy to oppose and act against it. Because on one hand, when you feel it, the only thing you can do is to leave. And it's like, I don't want to be part of this oppression, and then, okay, what to do? Then you leave, or you move to the West Bank, or, you know, but opening this discussion within this state about anti-Zionism is kind of sometimes like illegal even to say I'm not Zionist when you're in, and what does it mean to be not Zionist, but you know, participating in the parliament or you know, going for elections, because those questions we ask. So I'm Palestinian, but I live in the north, so technically I have Israeli citizenship, probably next to that kibbutz that you went to. So yeah, we also ask ourselves those questions of, so we're part of this because we were born there. We have to choose who should we vote, shouldn't we vote, and all those questions about the joint list and what can we do. But then on the other hand, we also see that with time we're kind of, let's make this look, let's make it better, and that's kind of it driving today with Netanyahu. It's very easy, we want to remove Netanyahu, we want someone else because he's doing the worst. But historically, he's not the worst. Like the left-wing parties did, you know, crimes, did wars, and we all know the history. So that's interesting. I don't know if there is anything in the book, or maybe you have some stories about people who, because, yeah, I don't know. Share this.
Emily?
I mean, yeah, I think one of the things that comes to mind when you're speaking it's a very small movement, but there are movements of Israelis who are very far left, and are trying to do things to dismantle militarism in Israel and things like that. And I think that those are, you know, a lot of them are leaving, or they, you know, work very hard for 10 years and burn out and then decide they can't stay because of their ideologies. But I think that, there's a new movement of young high school students who are working around military refusal, which I think is one of the best sort of iterations of these kind of organizations, because and it's illegal, as you said, their organization, it's now called Messer Vote, is an illegal organization, but they're still working, and every year more and more high school students are deciding not to join the army for political reasons, and are doing it more publicly. And I think that that's, it's one way to help to break down that sort of narrative within especially Ashkenazi Jewish society that's very privileged. And for those, there is a new movie called Objector that just it just debuted and won Best International Film at some film festival in, I think, in Texas. It's
Arkansas?
a big one, maybe in Arkansas. Yes. And it's a really wonderful film about one girl named Italia who refused to join, and kind of it gives a really good glimpse into what that meant for her, and the kind of attitude of her family and all of the pressure that they're under. But I also wanted to say I agree that I think, to me, I disagree with Issa, and I don't think that the joint list joining is a good move. I think that it's offering to join. I mean, I don't think it's a good move. I think it's trying to make something that's ugly look prettier, but it's not actually changing anything, and it makes it a lot harder to fight against.
I think that the illusion of progress is far more dangerous in some ways than the status quo or even retrogression. It is a very, very dangerous thing. But I think that part of the problem here, right, is that this movement is so nascent and small and just like the thumb of the state is on it, that that's why there has to be external pressure on the state. There's no incentive to give up the system when, at best, you have sort of a, well, don't throw as many bombs at Gaza as you're doing right now. That is the most critique that's the harshest criticism you're gonna get. There has to be intense pressure, right, which comes, of course, in the form of BDS. It's the only way you're gonna embolden people within Israel, right, to sort of stand up and to do that. While pressure, you have to apply that real politic pressure, otherwise it won't happen.
There's been a hand up, yes.
Yeah, I'm tired of it. I'm just kidding. It's very interesting, and I really appreciate the experience from the panel, who went from that move of being Jewish and walking the path towards, I would say, enlightenment. It's always hard, I believe, to you must have the feeling of sometimes renouncing your roots or things of the kind. But my question is very burning and actual, actually. You made several times a parallel between South Africa and Israel. And do you think, as it happened for South Africa, that the day the US decided to withdraw its unconditional support to the apartheid state of South Africa, do you think the same would happen if the US would withdraw its unconditional support to Israel? Do you think the same thing would happen, that Israel would feel so much pressure that they would be forced into a one-state solution with a more democratic regime? That's the first fold of my question. The second fold, do you see any candidate in 2020 would have, in the US, would have, for lack of a better word, balls and stamina to resist the pressure from the political landscape and different lobbying groups?
I guess
We're gonna take a few more.
Yeah. I think these are awesome questions. I think also it's important not to think that this book represents a monolithic ideas of any of these answers to any of these questions. I think it's really more about enlightening, as to take your word, American or generally just Jews who are Zionists, and kind of finding that enlightenment to move away from that and for the reasons why that happened. My personal view to your question is that I think the U.S. influence on Israel has diminished greatly in the last decade. I think it would have an influence, but wouldn't necessarily mean the same as it did with South Africa. And I also I don't think there's any mainstream candidate. I mean, Bernie has said a few things, but generally not amazing.
Excuse me, I think Israel has more influence on American politics than America has on
Potentially.
Israeli
yeah.
politics.
Though I mean, I do think that, like, you know, I don't know that the end of aid will change Israel's behavior, but I know that continuing to give them aid won't. So
Yeah, I don't mean to say that wouldn't have
Yeah.
impact, but I think your question was, would it have that would it result in the disintegration of like the state and like forthwith? I'm doubtful, but yeah.
And we tend to blame. I'm sorry. We tend to blame also a lot of like in America or the Jewish state also, but the Europeans had a tremendous role also playing prior to the creation of Israel. And I think the British control of the territories, the way they washed their hands off the entire situation, the covering of the murder of Bernadotte, for example, by the Secret Service in the MI5 at the time, also led to this cluster of different horrible situations that we are ending up today. Sorry, Professor, I interrupted.
You didn't interrupt anybody. Israel might not, you know, from one day to the next, collapse or bite the dust or admit defeat or whatever. But I think it would really severely, it would push them a long way in that direction. And the U.S. influence, the one good thing about Trump is that I think the U.S. has less credibility, and therefore can will have less power to do more damage. But although that hasn't happened yet, but the U.S. has a lot of power to prevent other countries from making changes in their, from accepting BDS, for instance. I don't quite understand why France has decided to condemn BDS. I was quite shocked by. It's very different from the position that the French were taking some time back. But I do think that that Europe would feel freer to move in a good direction if the U.S. were not exerting so much pressure, and financial pressure, and all kinds of other pressure at the UN, the veto. So I do think that if the U.S. were to withdraw aid, that it would be the beginning of the end. Maybe the beginning of the end would take a long time, but I do think it would be a very substantial move.
That's never going to happen.
This gentleman's had a question since the beginning.
Oh, I'm sorry.
No, hi. I appreciate you mentioning first Palestinian diversity, because this question is coming from a Palestinian atheist, Antiochian Orthodox. I just watched by the way, I mean, all of your talks were incredibly moving. I just watched the documentary by Abby Martin about Gaza. I don't know if you've heard it, just came out a few days ago. And it reminded me, I knew that, but I'd forgotten that 95% of Israelis supported the war of Gaza in 2014.
Including some so-called peaceniks like David Grossman.
Yeah, and I'm involved in a school in Tel Aviv that I travel frequently to Israel for that, and I've know a lot of the upper echelon of so-called Tel Aviv liberal community, and I don't see anybody. I didn't meet anybody who's in any way moving towards the kind of position that we're talking about. In the U.S., JVP, I understand Rebecca Philcommer said at one point that she thinks 5% of Jews in America are non-Zionist, or I don't know if that was like just a sort of pulled a number out of the air.
Probably about it.
But
You said that sounds high?
Sounds hot.
I think that's JVP's goal in the next
to get to
couple of years
5%.
to get,
So we're not even
to
we're
get
not even-
5% of the Jewish
But with-
population to.
But without a
use
doubt,
JVP.
I mean, the younger Jewish people, right? I mean, that demographic is changing both drastically and rapidly. I mean, it's quite remarkable, and I guess we will not see change until this generation of millennials, I guess, and younger people sort of get to positions of power, which they're just kind of barely starting to do now. How do you see that playing out? I mean, you said nothing's going to change in Israel unless there's pressure being applied. I think as far as South Africa is concerned, I think the Israel and the Zionist network globally is far more powerful than South Africa ever was in terms of its ability to influence, having large populations of Jews in the key countries like France, UK, Australia, Canada, etc., but not just the US, etc. So and that's maybe not change. If it's changing as much or as little as the US. So the other thing is, and then it'll be a question at the end, is I think the power of the support for Israel is really three-legged in the US. One is the Jewish Americans. The second is evangelical Christians. And the third is the incredible contribution of Israel to security, intelligence, and all of these, the kind of military industrial contribution that Israel is making. And I would say right now that the Jewish American influence, maybe not in terms of money, but in terms of how vocal and powerful and strong it is the least of those three at the moment. As long as there's the war on terrorism is still very much alive, and all of these things. With people like you being now restricted from going there, is there? I mean, it is. I've always believed that it's through the hearts and minds of the Jewish population and the Israelis, right? Do you actually see? I mean, are we going to have? Gaza, for example, is unlivable next year, right? No more water, etc. Are we? Do we have? Is there time before basically the Palestinians are all forced to leave, right? I mean, right now Gazans can't leave, but I can tell you most of them would leave if they could. Is there? Do you have hope, basically? I mean, all these things are very, very deeply moving, and but I mean, whether it's Bernie or and I'm a supporter of Bernie, but whether it's Bernie or Trump, right? I'd just like to hear, how you feel about this. That, I mean, shouldn't change what you do, right? Because this is something very deeply personal and important for you to do. But I just feel like it's hopeless.
No.
I think
There's never hopelessness. No.
But I think
I mean, I'm talking more like facts and reality,
It's been
not
70 years.
not like just the hearts. Yeah,
I think
and
that
minds.
I think in the sense that if the goal is to get where we want to be with just jump through time and we're there, then it is hopeless, right? That's impossible. The idea that we're going to be there by next year it's just not going to happen. I think you're right in the sense that it's going to take, and this is just, I think, the unfortunate consequence of how you get white people in the United States to care about something, is that it's got to get really bad before they even think about it. I'm in a voting rights class, and we watched we talk about Selma. We talked about Selma yesterday, right? And it wasn't until you had this horrendous videos on every TV screen of people just being bludgeoned by police officers, right, that you get at least a plurality of those who were silent before to say, well, I don't know about this.
But this is in the U.S. though, right?
And I think that the U.S. is key, right, to this situation. And I think that that kind of stuff it has happened. It's going to continue happening, but I'm not hopeless in the sense that, like, the same way that 5%, let's say 5% of Jews are standing up against Zionism. What percentage of white Christians in the United States are standing up against white supremacy in the way that anti-Zionist Jews stand up against Zionism, right? Now, like, even a liberal white person, right, is still complicit in all of these countless things that perpetuate white nationalism in the United States. So I think it's a larger question about how to change. How do you untangle and undo these repressive regimes that permeate the world? And I think that if we say, well, you can't, what's the point, right? So I think facts are one thing. We have to act based on what has to eventually happen, whether it happens next year or in 10 years or in 20 years or in 50 years. If we don't say something, then
I'm not discouraging.
No, I know. But do you see what I mean? Like, it's like it's almost like you have to ignore sometimes like there's the fact that it's not going to happen next year. If you dwell on those sorts of things, then you'll never get anywhere.
Most revolutionaries are optimists.
Yeah.
They have to be.
Yeah.
Necessarily.
But is there
There
another-
are protests all over the Arab world, South America, everywhere, because there is something happening with technology, with the spread of social media. There is more and more communication. People are becoming aware, perhaps because of as a backlash to all the right-wing white nationalism that's happening in Europe and the United States. And the United States has always been at the forefront of many of those movements, the hippie movement, all that started here. The fact that we're having this organization, this discussion right now about this with Jewish Americans, to me, I find it extraordinarily hopeful. I deplore also the lack of leadership in Palestinian territories, unfortunately. I think they have been so lame. I mean, really, the Palestinians have been cursed with the worst leadership. If there was somebody like a Mandela or somebody like that who really believed that big, large action and having that kind of charisma that would make these people, demonstrate and have peaceful I guarantee you, I mean, I read an article somewhere that 3% of the population, sustained protests will result into change. Hariri just quit his prime ministership. It's happening all over the place. As long as people have that courage and that passion in going for what they want,
sorry to interrupt.
We'll get there.
Aren't we locked into past thinking? I think what you said is absolutely correct. Look at Native Americans. Look at people in Australia and New Zealand. We've lived with the idea of groups of people being wiped out. It's happened through the history of man. Why are we stuck on issues of nationalism when you've got 50 million people who are displaced? We've got a much bigger issue here. You're absolutely right. Next year, no way. It's good to have optimism, but maybe how do you act in a way which actually changes some of the philosophy the world in general is operating with regards to issues of race, religion, etc. And maybe the answer is, how do we make, as you say, we're not talking about a huge number of people, how do we make it possible for them to have a state, maybe not physically where they are? It's great that the Americans have at least been willing today to say that the Armenians were persecuted. Okay, it's taken us how long? The issue you're bringing up is going to happen. There will probably be a lot of loss there. But what do we do as a world that makes a possibility for those people, which may not be sitting right there, but somewhere else? Can't we think a little bit more towards a future world?
I think people are thinking towards a future world. And, I don't know what the situation is in Australia, but certainly there are very vibrant and vital Native American movements. The Native Americans are far from exterminated. We may, no thanks to us, but they're still around, and they're still fighting for their rights, and very actively. So I don't think that's a very, I don't think that
we have grown up to accept what happened to the Native Americans. And I'm sure there are people who will grow up to accept what's happening, unfortunately, in Palestine.
I don't think so. I think actually what most white Americans accepted it when it was happening, but young people these days are really brought up to question that and have a very different idea of
Columbus Day is Indigenous Peoples Day now.
Yeah,
Yeah.
That's why I asked
Yeah.
my question.
I
Why did you get young people in America to really, and if you really believe young people in America are ready, are they out to vote? Are they really making their voice known? Because that is the hope. We all agree it's the young.
Well, I think if you look at the 28, I mean, go ahead.
No, I mean, I was just going to say, to me, the looking forward is looking at collective liberation. And I think that we have to take all of these different areas that are rising up and connect the issues. Because if we do that, then we do have the majority and we do have the ability to make change. And I think in the US, collective liberation, you see Black Lives Matter working with the Native communities in on the pipeline issues. You see these, and those are making changes. And I think that to me, that's not something that necessarily was pushing forward in the past. And I think it's something that we need to really be looking at, is how, if Palestine is free, but Native Americans here aren't getting their rights, then what does that mean? If Native Americans here get their rights, then, and Palestine's not free, what does that mean? But if we can all look at the ways that our struggles are connected, then we can move forward and make a new kind of world. And I think that's what gives me
That's a
optimism.
That's a wonderful answer. Stephanie has had her hand up for a long time, and then
You said the first thing I was going to say, Carolyn. The second thing is that I think that one way to get the issue out about Palestine to all Americans, not only Jewish ones and not only Arab and Iranian ones, but to point out that this war on terrorism and all of these endless wars that have been going on in North Africa and Southwest Asia, Afghanistan, armaments to Libya, Syria, all of these have something to do with preserving Israel's military superiority over all of its neighbors put together. And it is going to be ordinary Americans, mainly working class, who are going to be drafted for this fight. And this is where I think we can get in and say, this is what you are going to be drafted to fight for. Reactionary monarchies in the region, and above all, and a part of the apartheid state of Israel.
And
what we're
oil.
going to be fighting for is something that is patently and blatantly unjust. And it's important not only for Israelis to use Musniks, but American youth have to be as well.
Is it possible to use the shock and awe of peace? Because we get plenty of shock and awe from all persecutors, but shock and awe of peace would be good. So,
yeah.
I think we're running out of time, but I'm just dying to ask one question. This book seems to be a conversation opener. How did your families, how did you deal with having your families reading it? Are you speaking in universities and synagogues, and how is this book, fabulous book, going to be used?
Well, synagogues, we have been spectacularly unsuccessful so far. We were able to get into one synagogue because one of my contributors, Elise Cohen, belongs to a synagogue in Atlanta, and she strong-armed her rabbi and fought and refused to accept any of his alternative solutions. And so in fact, we had a program there that was quite interesting. And my husband and I just happened to be in Atlanta visiting a friend at the time, so I was able to join in that. We're still working on Washington's new non-Zionist synagogue, the so-called New Synagogue Project, and haven't yet managed to get them to invite us. I talked to a number of people who were sure that their very progressive synagogues would want to invite us, and when they brought the issue up, no, they did not. So there we have not been successful. We are trying. We had an event at Stanford. My wonderful publisher, Michel Mushabek, who is Palestinian, arranged a program at UMass Amherst, and we had 60 people. It absolutely filled up the room, and it was great. And we're going to have GW's JVP is going to organize something in January. Churches have been the most receptive, and one of our very receptive churches is represented in the audience, and he was able to organize a very productive session at the Calvary Baptist Church downtown, and is planning to organize something at a Baptist Church, Ravenswood Baptist Church in Virginia. They've been great. My parents are no more. I do think that they would have been receptive. They were not fanatic Zionists. And in fact, my father told me very close to the end of his life, I was never a Zionist. But since he was so hard to talk to, because he would, argue and tell you should have known this, and that I never was able to pursue the conversation more, to my great regret. My brother has been fantastic. He has been giving copies of the book to his former colleagues at law firms, to his friends at his country club. Most of them are not at all happy about receiving this copy and don't say that they'll read it, but he's been very, very supportive of it. My cousins won't read it. They just haven't been able to bring themselves to read it. And I've noticed that with a number of liberal Zionists, that I think they're so afraid of losing their faith that they're afraid of reading a book that might, in fact, force them to begin thinking otherwise. You all, I'm sure, have different experiences.
I won't go through parents, cousins, brothers, everyone else, but I will say I am also my father's Catholic, mother's Jewish, and it was definitely a more difficult conversation with my mom, and it was first, I think, and I guess to credit to them to some extent, like they're more fear about this conversation was more fear about my safety and my professional career and all the risks to me. It was much more personal, and over time the conversation has developed more into a recognition that my story is a product of them, and I think that really is kind of shifted the discussion in a positive way. And then I think really, as I mentioned, it's hard for me to read the story, but I really thank Carolyn, because bringing us together, I don't know if that's true for you two, but I know for likely others, it's something that you have to kind of continuously confront, and therefore you will I bring it up in my day-to-day much more because of this book, and this has a ripple impact, and all of you being here and having this conversation, and either buying the book or talking about the book or reading some stories, and hopefully has an impact. And that's to your question. Speaking about millions of people is one thing, and getting in small rooms and trying to solve small problems, I think, is the thing where I'm putting my energy towards.
Good. Thank you so much for coming, and thank you so much for inviting us to your bookstore.
Yeah, thank you all again for coming. Really, really great and important topic. And I wish you success in trying to get your message out there to as many people as you can. So join me again, thanking them for coming tonight.
Thank you.